Hey everyone, welcome to my second of two videos on this, the Nikon FE. This is one of the more requested cameras that I get for video reviews and manuals. And it's just taken a long time to get one that works. So since it works, the first thing I'm going to show you, because you can do nothing whatsoever with your FE, well, you can't use your FE to the fullest of its ability if it doesn't have batteries in it. So let's start with changing the battery. I've got a nickel, and if you're in the US, a nickel is the perfect size for the slot on the battery cap here. In other countries, different coins work pretty well. And there we go. We're going to take off the battery cap. So we've got the battery cap off, and let's take a look at the battery cap itself. There we go. You can see it's telling you what voltage batteries, there you go. You can see it's telling you what voltage batteries to use, 1.5 volt times 2. And it's showing you how to put them in. So what this tells you is that the positive goes towards the top and the negative goes towards the metal bit. And it's got a little outline of the batteries there to help jog your memory. The FE takes two of these guys, which are LR44, A76, S76, AG13, 357, they're all the same thing. And what you want to do is pop them in like this. You know it's done correctly if you're holding the battery cap with the metal part down, and you can read the text on the battery. Just pop these in. This is actually really easy to do if your camera's upright. It's not always easy to do if it's upside down. And then just screw in the battery cap. The battery cap should screw in very easily. If it takes force or if it feels like it's not threading easily, then back it out and try again. If you force the battery cap to tighten when it doesn't want to, you risk cross-threading the battery cap, which could make it impossible to get off, or at least very hard, and would mean you'd either have to buy a new battery cap or a new battery cap and base plate in order to be able to put batteries in your camera again. Now that we have batteries in the camera, we're going to come up here to the battery check button, and we're going to push it down and see if maybe, okay, there you go. You can see that little red light turns on, and that indicates that the batteries are good. So we're set to go. Next thing that we're going to do is load film into the camera. This is a standard roll of 35 millimeter film. Any 35 millimeter film will work. And this stuff, so color, black and white, slide, whatever you want to use, if it's 35 millimeter, it will work. So to open up the film back, you're going to find the film back lock up here, which is this little switch by the ISO dial. Pull it back towards the back of the camera, lift up on the film release knob here, and pull it until the back pops open. There we go. We're going to take our film cassette and we're going to drop it into this part of the camera here, and we're now going to push this back into place. This doodad engages the film so that if we pull out a little bit, you can see how it will rewind the film. And it does that because it has little forks on it there. You can see them, I think. Yeah, that engage the inside of the film cassette right there. If you push this back down with the film back open, you have to hit the release again, because the release here locks this in place. It doesn't lock the film back in place. So I can't lift this up right now unless I hit the release button on the ISO dial right here, and then I can lift it up again. So it's a bit of a misnomer to call this the film back release thing. It's really more of the film door opening, unlocking, release thing, but that's a little bit more complex and doesn't fit in the manual as well. So we're going to pull out a bit of a leader here, and we're going to take the end of the film and we're going to put it into this little slot there, or maybe the one on the other side of the roller. That'll work better, I'm sure. Nope, it won't. I'm going to hold the gear here. Maybe that'll help. There we go. And we get that fit into the take-up spool. I'm going to trip our shutter. And it's a really good idea to have your shutter in M90 mode right now because it's going to be mechanical regardless of whether you have batteries in it or not. It will work just fine and you have a predictable shutter speed. If you're in auto mode and you have your lens cap on, you could end up with an 8-second shutter speed every time you want to advance the film, I believe. Anyway, so here you can see how the film is fitting through the camera. The guide pin here is helping to keep the film moving this way. You can see the inner guide rails through the sprocket holes that will help keep this flat when the film pressure plate sandwiches up against it. And you can see then how the film fits in between the top and bottom rails so that it doesn't move up and down. And then the sprocket holes here engage the sprocket and it gets taken up. And that's how it moves through the camera. So what we're going to do next is we're going to close the back of the camera. We're going to advance the film, and well, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to tighten this up. And you shouldn't be able to spool and spool and spool. That means that it's not advancing through the camera correctly. But you want to tighten this up so that when you advance the film, you can watch this rotate the opposite direction of the arrow to know that your film is advancing correctly. Next, we're going to advance to frame 1. And you can see here that the film is advancing correctly. So we're at frame 1. I put in 200 ISO film, so let's adjust this to 200 ISO. And now we're in good shape to take pictures. We have the ISO set correctly. The exposure compensation dial is set to 0. This is spinning when I advance. Everything's good to go. When you use film for real, what you want to do is go through the whole 24 or 36 exposures and just take the pictures as you're going through the roll. At the end of your roll, you'll push this button here. This is the film release button. You saw if I tried to rewind the film before, nothing happened. But if I push this, now I can rewind the film. This disengages that sprocket so that the film can be rewound. So let me advance here a little bit and I'll show you what this looks like. If you were using film for real, you do not open the back of the camera until you've gone through your entire roll and rewound your entire roll. Film is one and done. Once it sees light, it's exposed. Either it records an image or it gets completely wiped out by being exposed to light if you do something like open up the film back while the film is in the camera. But I want you to see how this process works. So when you take a picture, the shutter actuates and then you advance the film, and you can see it being advanced onto the take-up spool here. And this sprocket is keeping it from being pulled backwards. There we go. Push the rewind button, and now we can rewind it. As you get close to the end, you'll hear a sound like this. That clicking sound, which you can generally hear some version of outside of the camera, lets you know you're near the end of your rewinding process. There we go. And then in real life, you would rewind this until it's rewound the whole way into the cassette. I'm going to be reusing this cassette for another video today, so I'm going to take it out like that. At this point, your film's out, you've rewound it the entire way. You would grab your next roll of film and toss it in, or if you're done for the day, you wouldn't do that. The next thing we're going to do is talk about flash photography with the Nikon FE. The Nikon FE has two different places to put a flash. You can put it on the hot shoe here, and the center dot means that any standard flash will work with it. That smaller dot is what some Nikon flashes will use to communicate with the FE to illuminate that light to let you know when it's ready to take a picture. But any flash that you can buy that will fit into a standard hot shoe will work with this camera. You can also connect your flash to the PC port right here if your flash can take a cable. So those are the two ways to do it. When you're taking a flash photo, what you want to do is set your camera to 1/125th of a second, generally speaking, unless you're going to take a longer photo on purpose. Say you set it to 8 seconds. That would mean you would take a long exposure and your flash would trigger in that exposure. There are reasons, and we'll talk about some of this, some of the mechanics and some of the creative reasons to do some of that stuff as we go here. So, when you take a flash photo, let's say you're about to have your picture taken. If your flash is up here and it points at the person or subject, the light's going to come out this way and bounce back at the camera, and it's going to make your subjects look flat and waxy. It's not a good look for anyone. So if you put a flash on your hot shoe, what you want to do is have one that bounces up. You want to have it bounce up at the ceiling and then back down at your subject, and then when the flash reaches your subject, it'll come back at the lens. Some portion of it will. The reason for that is because we're used to seeing people lit from the top, whether they're in the sun or underneath lights on the ceiling. We see and think about people as being lit from above. So having a flash bounce up to a ceiling and then back down will give you more flattering results, especially if you're taking pictures of anything, because everything we see is generally lit from above. When you use a flash, I said to set it at 1/125th or slower, and the reason is because of the way that focal plane shutters work. If your shutter works this way, you take a picture and the first curtain opens and then the second curtain closes behind it, and that's what gives you the exposure. Then when you advance, they reset like this. So at 1/125th of a second, the first curtain opens, and then the entire film plane is exposed to light for approximately 1/125th of a second, and then the second curtain closes, and then they advance when you advance the film. At 1/2 of a second, the first curtain opens, and then the entire film plane is open to light for about 1/2 a second, and then the second curtain, and then you advance the film. But if you're at 1/1000th of a second, the first curtain opens and then the second curtain comes behind it. So if you're using a flash and you take a picture now, let's say at 1/1000th of a second, your curtains will block everything that's behind them, and only a strip of light, well, in this camera horizontally, would be exposed by the flash. So the 1/125th is the fastest shutter speed at which the entire film plane is open to light at any given time for a flash to trigger and then to work properly. Anything slower, the film plane is still open to light. So let's say that you were sitting out in the city and it was nighttime, and the buildings were illuminated and the street lights and maybe some lights for a celebration of some kind. It's a lovely scene. You want to take a picture of yourself or your friends or whatever in that scene. Well, if you take a picture of the flash with the flash at 1/125th, they will probably be very well illuminated and nothing behind them will be, because there's not enough light from all the surrounding lights to take that good picture and get the lights in focus as well as your subject. So let's say that we switch this to 1/2 second. Yeah, that looks good. Let's imagine that 1/2 of a second is a proper exposure to get the city lights behind you and your friends to be illuminated on your film. If you take a flash picture like this, your flash will trigger and then your shutter will stay open for another 1/2 second, drink in all the light from the city lights, and then your subjects rather, and who received the flash will be illuminated, and the background of these dim lights. If it's really dim lights, maybe you need to go to a full 1/8 of a second. Or if you're trying to do some sort of foreground for a star trail shot, might be in bulb, and just trigger your flash at some point during the bulb exposure, either manually or, I forget if this is trailing curtain or opening curtain, meaning I forget if the flash triggers at the beginning of the exposure or at the end. But at any rate, one of the nice uses of flashes with longer shutter speeds is you can do things like get a dim background illuminated as well as your subjects in the foreground. So the next thing let's talk about is exposure compensation and how to use the exposure compensation dial. So the exposure compensation dial, we're just going to go through the mechanics of it now, but we're going to talk about how to use it creatively in a moment later in the video when we talk about double exposures. The mechanics of it are that if you're in auto and you set your aperture, what auto mode means is that your camera will pick the best shutter speed for you based on your aperture and the light in your scene. So if you have this set at 0, it's going to do the best it can. If you have this set at 1, it's going to double the length of the shutter speed that it would give you because it can't adjust the aperture and give you more light than you need. So let's say that you have it on auto and your camera says, okay, I need to do 1/300th of a second. Because it's stepless, it can do any speed, not just the marked one. So let's say right now it needs 1/300th. on 0. Now you switch it to +1, it will give you 1/150th. If you switch it to +2, it will give you 1/75th. The plus indicates that it's giving you +1 stop. Conversely, if you need a 1/300th of a second exposure, and you go to -1, it would give you 1/600th of a second. If you went to -2, it can't do 1/1200th, so it would do 1/1000th of a second. So in general, you'll want to leave this on 0. An exception to this is, let's say that you have something very, very bright in the center of your image, super bright, and it's going to throw off your metering. Okay, well, we want to have that super bright thing be properly illuminated, not super bright, so let's take a stop of light off. Or let's say that you have something very dark in the center of your image. Well, we want to have a little bit better illumination on that, so let's add a half stop of light. And the little dots in between the 1 and the 2 indicate a half stop instead of just a full stop. And so that's one of the things you can do with this, and the mechanics of it is just that you lift the dial and adjust it until the orange line is lined up with the setting that you want to use. That's an auto mode. To the best of my knowledge, it does not affect your shutter or aperture. I believe that this does nothing whatsoever in manual mode, except possibly tell you a different shutter speed. I believe it does actually in manual mode have the light meter tell you a different shutter speed than it would actually need. So if your actual shutter speed in manual mode should be 1/125th and you hit +1 with this, then it will tell you to go to 1/60th, if I remember correctly from this about this camera. Next thing we're going to do is look through the camera's viewfinder, and we're going to talk about what we see and what's in it. So this mock-up that you're seeing now is what you would see looking through the viewfinder. Along the top, you'll notice there's a window that gives you the aperture readout. So if you adjust your aperture ring, that number is going to change to show you the aperture that your lens is set to. Then you have a nice big and bright viewfinder in there. If you have the standard focusing screen, it's basically a clear viewfinder with a circle in the center and then a split prism inside of that. With that split prism, if you find a vertical line and focus your camera, when that vertical line in the split prism lines up, everything on the plane of that vertical line is in focus. And you can watch that by going in and out of focus. And at the same time as you're going in and out of focus on that vertical line, also look around the matte screen and see how the focus in your image changes as you adjust the focus with your split prism. On the left side is your light meter, and when you are set to A mode, what's going to happen is that the blue line is going to tell you what shutter speed you're in. So the blue line is connected to your shutter dial. In A mode, it sits at A, and then in any of the specific shutter speeds, it rests on them. That black line tells you what your shutter speed should be. So if you're in A mode, it tells you what your shutter speed is going to be. So right now, the black line is halfway between a 30th and a 60th for me. That means that the shutter speed is going to be about 1/45th. If you switch to manual mode, you can't get to 1/45th. So you either go with 1/60th or 1/30th and try to get as close as possible. If you adjust the shutter speed dial till you get to M90, then the blue line lines up with the M in the shutter range on the left, and in bulb mode, it indicates it by the blue line going over the B. And that's the viewfinder, and that's how you use it. It's a very nice, easy to use, easy to read viewfinder. It's laid out very well. It's very simple. It's not going to get in the way. It's one of the things about the FE that FE users like the most. It's bright and it's very simple. We're going to talk now about how to use NAI lenses, even though I don't actually have one to show you how to use it. When you use NAI lenses, you can use either auto or manual shutter speeds. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to show you how to do this with auto. Before you mount an NAI lens, you want to push this button down and flip this little tab back here. So I hope you can see that that is now pointed generally upwards instead of generally straight out. You're going to take your NAI lens, which again, this is not. And NAI lenses have the rabbit ears and then a smooth ring on the bottom, not a ring with a couple of prominences on the bottom. You'll mount your NAI lens, just like that. And then what you're going to do is you're going to set your aperture. So let's say that you want to take a picture at f8. You're then going to push down your depth of field preview lever. If you're in auto mode, you can go ahead and just take your photo. So what I'll do is I'll illustrate the difference here. I'm going to be at f1.8. With depth of field preview at f1.8, nothing happens. Take a picture, that's the speed. If we go down to f5.6, you should have been able to hear that that was a slightly longer exposure. Now if we go down to f22, you could probably hear that was an even longer exposure. So what happens when you use the depth of field preview lever is that it stops your aperture down. With an NAI lens, this is the only way for the camera to know what aperture you're set at because the lens cannot otherwise communicate it to the camera. So with an NAI lens, you hold your depth of field preview button down, and then in auto mode, you take a picture and it works. Let's say that you don't hold the depth of field preview down and you're at f22. In auto mode, it's still going to stop the aperture down to f22, but it will meter at f1.8, meaning that all of your images will be exceedingly dark if you don't hold the DOF preview button down with an NAI lens in auto mode. In manual mode, it's a similar process, but a little bit more involved in that what you want to do is look through the viewfinder, line up your scene, make sure your aperture is set to what you want to have it set at, hold down the depth of field preview lever, and now the black line that's over on the side will go from wherever it had been to some lower number. Adjust your shutter speed to that lower number. You can then release the depth of field preview button and take your picture. And you can release the depth of field preview button in manual because the camera will always stop the shutter down. Once you have a manual shutter speed set, you don't have to keep holding the depth of field preview button. And then if you switch lenses and you go back to an automatic indexing lens, just make sure that's flipped up so that it can engage with the lens again. And now you're ready to go with your newer lens than the NAI lenses are. Okay, so we're going to swap out the focusing screen in the Nikon FE. The first thing that I want you to notice here is that strip of foam, which is not original, and we can tell it's not original because it covers the release. So we're going to have to clean that out. I'm just going to hold it upside down like this and tilt it forward because I don't want that foam getting onto the focusing screen. That's a good way to ruin a perfectly good focusing screen. I'm just going to use a cotton swab to pull it out like that. You can see it there. And we can get a better view. We can get a better view now of what we're looking at. And you can see how there's only foam adhesive and there's some leftover of the original foam there around that clip. That clip shouldn't have any foam on it. So if you have a clip that's got foam on it, somebody has put it there and shame on them for doing it that lazy way. That clip is what's going to release the focusing screen for us to access. And basically when you push that clip, there's a little metal carrier tray, and you can maybe see it around the focusing screen that holds it in place. Gravity is going to pull all of that assembly down. So I'm going to set the camera upright. I'm going to push on this clip here, and it's going to magically work. There it goes. And gravity has pulled the focusing screen down. Now, if you're replacing the focusing screen with a different one, it will come with a thing that looks like tweezers that you use to grab that little tab and pull this out. And then the focusing screen here gets stored in the box that the new focusing screen is coming in. At this point, you pull this off to the side. I don't have any canned air on me or a rocket blaster, but what you do is you use a rocket blaster preferably to get some air in there to get any pieces of dust or debris off of the prism and out of the shutter box. Now you're going to use your tweezers to grab the new focusing screen. You're going to slide it right in there so it rests on the tray. There we go. And almost there, not quite. That looks like that's pretty close. And then you'll turn the tweezers around and they should have a piece that you use to push this up into place. There we go. Looks There we go. So you might be able to see how that's seated in there. So once you have the focusing screen in, you have to have the camera lying flat, and then you use the tweezer bit to push the tray back into place, and it's staying in there. The key to getting the focusing screen back in is that the camera has to sit flat on the surface when you close the caddy. Otherwise, that focusing screen won't align correctly in relationship to the hinge, and you won't be able to close the frame that holds it in place, the caddy, and it'll just keep popping out over and over, and you'll risk damaging the screen. So it's best just to do it correctly the first way, and just make sure when you close the screen, always use your tweezers for everything, and then close the screen by popping it up when the camera's vertical. I have done this enough times that I can generally get away without using tweezers, but it's not something I like to do. So do as I say, not as I do. Use the focusing screen changing tweezers. Apologize for the illumination level changing. One of my studio lights is on the fritz, and sometimes it just cuts out. Other times it sizzles. I'm sure neither of those are good things. At any rate, next thing we're going to talk about is how to take pictures with this camera. We're going to go through the whole process of taking pictures with a standard automatic indexing lens in both automatic and manual mode. So if you're standing behind your camera, let's start with automatic mode because it's a little bit easier. You've got your film speed set, you've got film in your camera, your shutter is unlocked. What you want to do is set the aperture to what you would like to have it be. And if you've never, or you're new to photography or haven't used a camera like this, the only way to find out what you want your aperture to be is experimenting and seeing what the results give you with different aperture settings on different subjects. Next, you want to focus your lens to wherever you get your focus, and then just take your picture. It's really simple. With the FE, all you have to do in auto mode is set the aperture and focus and take a picture, and you're set. In manual mode, all that you've got to do is set your aperture. Then once you know what your aperture is, line up the blue line inside of the viewfinder with the black line, or get them as close as you can, focus, and take your picture. And that's how you take a picture with this camera in manual mode. Okay, that's great and all. What about double exposures? We've seen how to do a single exposure, now let's do a double exposure. For double exposures, we're going to start in manual mode because it's easier to do a double exposure in manual. The mechanics of the double exposure are that if you have your film and your meter says that 1/125th of a second at f/5.6 is a correct exposure, and you take a picture in advance, that frame that you just took will be properly exposed. If you do a double exposure with the correct settings twice, you're going to have a very thick, a dark negative. It will be hard to print or hard to scan. And that's not a good situation. You don't want to have two full blasts of light hitting the film. So if you know that you're in manual mode and f/5.6 and 1/125th is the correct shutter speed, you need to cut the amount of light in half. So which way are we going to go? These are fractions of a second, which means half as much light is twice the number. 1/250th of a second is half as much time as 1/125th of a second. I prefer to control double exposures on the shutter speed dial because I focus more on depth of field in image composition. So if you went from 1/125th to 1/250th, you take your first picture. Don't advance it just yet. You want to grab this dial and then dial it back towards the back of the camera. So if you're holding it, you're going to use your index finger like that to pull this back, and then you advance the film. There we go. I'll do that for you one more time here, so you can see without my fingers being in the way. You pull this backwards, and what's going to happen is as you advance the film, then you're just going to have to move your finger out of the way. When you get to a point where you have to move your finger out of the way, it's okay to do so. This lever allows the shutter to be rearmed without advancing the film. Okay, great. So we've taken our first exposure at f/5.6 1/250th. Now we take our second and we advance the film. Okay. With the FE, I believe you do not have to take a dead frame, but I am very particular about double exposures, so I always take a dead frame afterwards with any SLR camera. To take a dead frame, you want to switch it to f/22 and put your lens cap on. I also like to switch it to my fastest shutter speed and then take a picture and then advance it. And the reason that I take a dead frame is with a lot of cameras, and like I said, I don't think the FE2 requires a dead frame, but I'm cautious. But with a lot of cameras, after you do a double exposure, it takes part of a film advance until all the gearing re-engages and starts to advance the film. So a dead frame helps to ensure that your double exposure doesn't partially overlap your next frame and prevent both images from turning out. So anyway, that it's just a good practice to have. But let's say that you want to do a double exposure in auto mode. Okay, no problem. Let's go back to the aperture you want to use. f/5.6, 1.8, 1/16, f/16, does not matter at all. In auto mode, the camera is going to choose the shutter speed for you. So if you take your first image and now you take your second, you've given the film twice as much light as it should have because you're in auto mode. So what you need to do a double exposure in auto mode is come over here to the EV compensation dial, lift the silver ring and adjust it to -1. That's going to give the film half as much light as auto mode says it should have. Take your first photo, hold the double exposure lever down, advance the film. Take your second exposure, advance. Now, if you're done with double exposures, make sure you switch this back to 0, and you are good to go. And that's the process for taking a double exposure in auto mode. In auto mode, you're going to get even more accurate double exposures because if you need a 1/78 and a 1/223 for your two exposures, it can do that. And in fact, it can do half of each of those by adjusting these for the EV adjustment ring for your double exposures. So that's it. That is the Nikon FE. We've gone over everything you need to know to use it, all the features and functions. So if these two videos were helpful, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know I'm creating content which is helpful and useful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those below. I'm pretty good about responding fairly quickly to your comments every day or two. If you have suggestions or ideas for future videos, by all means, please let me know. And if I have the ability and knowledge to do them, I'm happy to. And many of the improvements in these videos over the years have been because of your comments. And one last thing, thank you everyone very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video series.